Hey, Mason here with a very important correction for my previous Mathematics Archmage video. A commenter pointed out that when I was doing POE DPS calculations, at 0.78 seconds, which is what I'm considering as a cycle, I will only have one Unleash steal, and this is correct because Unleash only gives you a steal every 0.71 seconds. So in my case, I used my Frostbolt cast speed plus 3 instances of Vortex with a cycle of this. But in 0.78 seconds, I only have one Unleash stack. So what does that mean? You see here that Unleash makes it so that spells gain a steal every 0.9 to 0.71 seconds. And in that case, that means they're only getting 18 Frostbolts from my cast of Frostbolt. So that's actually 18 hits, not 30 hits. And if we use the previous DPS calculation formula, that means hits per cycle times damage per hit divided by time per cycle. The hits per cycle is actually 18, not 30, times the damage, which is the same as what I was using before, divided by the time per cycle, which is 0.78, one cycle, which is 5.3 million DPS. On POB, it says that I do 9.5 million DPS, but that's actually not true. I'm actually only doing 5 million DPS or so, which is 55% of the DPS written in POB for this skill. So what does it look like if you wait for 2 stacks or you wait for 3 Unleash stacks? I did some calculations and I put in a table here. If we're waiting for 1 Unleash stack, that's 0.78. And that's 18 hits, because 9 times 2, with the total damage of this using the same previous damage number. And the DPS ends up being 5.8 DPS, so approximately. Again, in the previous calculation here, I used 7.8 per cycle, but we're going to say you have a tiny bit more cast speed so that you're matching this perfect threshold for Unleash stacks. So that would be 5.8. And then if you're waiting for 2 stacks, so you will do 3 casts of Frostbolt, which is 27 Frostbolts. And the damage of that is 6.2 with a DPS of 4.3. And then if you're waiting even longer for 2.3, for 3 stacks of Unleash, then you're doing 36 hits. I'm assuming that you're holding down your Frostbolt key, your Vortex key the entire time, because now you have 2.2 seconds to spam your Vortex key and cast it as many times as you want. So you're getting the maximum amount of hits by consuming as many Frostbolts as possible. So in this case, all the Frostbolts, that would do a total of 8 million damage, but with an actual DPS of 3.8 million DPS. So the issue here is that Vortex of Projection has now become hard gated by Unleash's ability to spam out extra Frostbolts. So unless you're using Arcanist brand, then you're gated by Unleash, which makes it very difficult because you cannot modify this in very easy ways. There's one node on the Oshabi Ascendancy, which gives you 20% cooldown reduction for Unleash. But aside from that, there's basically no other ways that are easy on a build to reduce this cooldown for Unleash. So now you're basically gating your attack speed or your cast speed by how many Frostbolts that come out per second by using Unleash support with a value that's unchangeable and difficult to manipulate. So what does this actually look like on a graph? 5.8 million DPS, 4.3 million DPS, 3.9 million DPS. Basically, if you want to play this build, you need to be spamming your Frostbolt. You need to click your Frostbolt as soon as it hits 1 Unleash stack on your hotbar, and then spam your Vortex on that constantly. Which means that you kind of really need very, very perfect ability to play, mechanical skill to actually play this build, only to get 5 million DPS, if that makes sense. So now I'm going to have a look at Ice Nova, because Ice Nova's DPS is still actually good, and talk about some of the key issues with Ice Nova. So the first one is the insane mana costs, which are very difficult on SSF. You also want a few Frostbolts on the boss at all times, which I'll explain and show later. And there's also the last question is whether you're going to use Kitava's Thirst or not. So the first one is the I need mana issue. The easiest way is Worm Sign Worm Scale Gauntlets, which gives you 4% reduced mana cost per endurance charge, and you have 4 because you're playing Hierophant. But there's a new option this league, which is the Kalissa's Grace Gloves, which gives you 50% reduced mana cost after 2 seconds of spending 800 mana. Sushi said this was bugged in his video. I'm not sure if it still is. There's other ways to get this is the Amethyst Ring here, which gives you 5% reduced mana cost on skills with I think it's a suffix craft. Sorry, it's a prefix craft. And you can have 2 of them. You can also use Tylus on the skill tree, which gives you, I think it is 3%, 3%, 3%, and 6%, which results in 15%. So if you look at my POB, this is what my POB looks like. I have lots and lots and lots of reduced mana cost of skills to basically bring this net value all the way down to, in this case, it will be 23% of the actual mana cost. That's how you kind of manage mana on Archmage of Ice Nova of Frostbolts. So some other more late game options You have the Watcher's Eye with a 15% chance to recover 10% mana when you use a skill. This one is huge. And you also have the Mana Mastery, which you should be clicking anyways, right? That's what you should be clicking. So once you get these two, you probably don't need these gloves. So either the Wormscale or the Foulborn, you probably don't need those anymore. But that's kind of the angle that you want to do with this. Inspiration Support has been nerfed to give less mana cost, not reduced mana cost. Normally, less is better because it's multiplicative. But in our case, it's actually worse because we have lots and lots and lots of reduced mana cost. The less mana cost will basically be in this case, it will be 34% less mana. So it will just be a multiplier on all of this. But if you can get like 5%, you can reduce the mana cost by even more because we're already hitting very, very small numbers for the total mana cost. So just from stacking a ton of reduced mana cost. So this change was a nerf to Inspiration. And Inspiration, you generally want to avoid this because it's not a damage link. So you want to try to look for some other ways to solve it. In this case, I'm using Worm Sign because I dropped one in SSF, and Tireless, these two with one of these rings because I don't have two of them. However, if you have Foulborn, it may be, if it's unbugged, like if it's fixed and it works, it's probably better. Or you can use a Mana Flask that gives you mana recovery. Okay, so the next question is how many Frostbolts per second do we need? I'm going to show you a demo now, but just for the TLDR, is generally greater multi-proj or greater volley is enough, unless your cast speed is absolutely absurd. So stuff like Coiling Whisper, Soul Eater stuff, you might want both projectile count supports, but generally just pick one and you should be good to go. And as a note for Frostbolts for Ice Nova, returning Proj and Arcanist Brand is very nice because Arcanist Branch has a limit for projectile range, which means the returning Projes will come back quicker. So I'm going to show this quickly in game. Alright, so the first thing to show is how Ice Nova and Frostbolt interact. The easiest way to show this is if I shoot one Frostbolt, I click once Ice Nova, you can see there's two pulses from it. And that's because it says on Ice Nova that over here it says can expand from up to 2 Frostbolt projectiles. This means that slower Proj is much, much less mandatory because generally you will get overlaps. Right, you can see that the overlaps are pretty generous because the Frostbolt projectiles, because the explosions are pretty quick after another, if that makes sense. So the next thing to keep in mind is the way Spell Echo works with Frostbolts. If I put in Greater Volley, which means I shoot 5 Frostbolts, Spell Echo should make it so that my Ice Nova will hit 4 times, right? Because if without this, it hits twice. So with this and Spell Echo, I'm casting 2 Ice Novas, which means it should be 4 hits. Let's have a look. So you can see that it's 4 hits. So how do we determine how many Frostbolt projectiles we need? It's actually very simple, because if you're casting Ice Nova without a Frostbolt, it will cast on your character, right? So if you're casting, similar to the way Vortex of Projection works, if you have an invalid Frostbolt cast, it will be on your character. So all we can do is we shoot our Frostbolts and we spam on it and see if it ever casts on my character. So you can see, it never casts on my character. That means that my cast speed is not high enough where I need more projectiles. If you have more cast speed, so for example, if you're using Coiling Whisper with Soul Eater, or you just have a ton of cast speed from your gear, and when you shoot your volley and you're spamming it on it, and the Frostbolts are appearing around, the Ice Novas are appearing around your character like this, that means that you need more projectiles. So you might put in greater multi-proj. But for my case, it's not needed because my cast speed's not high enough. The question between whether you want to use volley or multi-proj, it's really just personal preference. But the overlaps, remember that you want the Frostbolts to be overlapped. So if you're standing with a boss, like the boss is like from here to here, then you'll get good overlaps with greater multi-proj, right? Also for mapping, multi-proj is generally better because the spread of it is much, much nicer on you. However, if you're fighting a boss and the boss is further away, so say he's on the edge of my screen here, then this will obviously be better because all the explosions are centered around these Frostbolts. Generally, I'm fighting bosses being relatively close, so within half of my screen, so like they'll be shotgunned by this. So generally it's fine for me, because I don't really fight bosses or mobs on the very far side of my screen. However, it generally is just personal preference. The next thing to cover is the way returning Proj works with Frostbolts on Ice Nova. Previously I showed with Vortex of Projection, if you use Frostbolts with returning Proj, it won't let you cast on it. But Ice Nova's is different because you can actually cast on this. You see that I'm casting on it and it's perfectly fine. So here's what to keep in mind. The best way to use this is with the use of Arcanist Brand, and this is what Garatha used in 3.25. Arcanist Brand has a line that says projectiles from supported skills have 4.8 meters maximum range. And that means that the projectiles can't keep going indefinitely. So my personal choice for links for Frostbolt will be using Greater Volley or GMP, and then Arcanist Brand. If I'm using Arcanist Brand, it spawns the projectiles on the boss, but remember that the returning Proj makes the projectiles come back to you. So in this case, I'm just take off Arcanist Brand to show this. If I shoot this out and I walk like over here, you'll see that when they hit their max range, they will come back down to me. See, they're coming to me, right? Which means generally, if you want to fight a boss, you generally want to stand pretty close onto it, because all the projectiles will be coming back to you and converging on the boss, allowing you to just spam Ice Nova of Frostbolts on yourself. And that's kind of generally how you'll play this with Arcanist Brand, and I'll show you some quick clips of this on my Maven and Cirrus kills that I tested this on.
My collection.
You shall taste exceptional.
I will have what I want.
So, what about Kitava's Thirst? It's very simply just a personal preference. It's good if you have lots of cast speed and you have consistent Frostbolts coming out all the time. But personally, I found it rough because you want your helmet slot for stats mainly suppression, mana and life, and res. And my cast speed's not high enough for it to be very consistent all the time, and I noticed that sometimes it's a bit annoying in terms of its consistency. So again, back into game quickly with my Kitava's Thirst. I want to briefly just show you how this works. Got my Kitava's Thirst. I'm going to swap this helmet off of Kitava's Thirst and then put in my Frostbolt into my Kitava's Thirst with Greater Volley. So when I hold my Ice Nova, you see that they are coming out, and it seems like okay. You see that the stream is pretty consistent, but occasionally you may have dry streaks where there's just no Frostbolts are coming out, and so your damage is just very questionable. Like you can't get Frostbolts coming out. For Kitava's Thirst, I think GMP is not very good because you see the spread is huge, right? So you're not really getting any overlap unless you're literally sitting on the boss like right here. You might be getting some overlap. But generally for Kitava's Thirst, you really want to go with what do you call it? Greater Volley. So right here you can see that it took me a while to get Frostbolts coming out initially. So it's generally just a personal preference and a cast speed and gear kind of requirement. If you have lots and lots of cast speed, and you can basically proc this instantly, like you're attacking like multi times per second, and you have no issues with consistency, then you want to use it. Otherwise, you probably don't want to use Kitava's Thirst, and you want to just use the Arcanist Brand and Arcanist Brand, Greater Volley, and Returning Proj setup, which is personally what I will be using. Okay, so the conclusion is that 1, Vortex of Projection is now estimated to be nerfed by about 45% with this fix in the patch notes. And the easiest way to estimate this value is you're getting 5 hits from 5 Frostbolts instead of 9 hits, which you were getting before with Spell Echo. So this skill is basically gated by your Frostbolts per second, your output of Frostbolts per second. And Unleash, again mentioned before, Unleash has a timer that's fixed and very hard to manipulate, which means that it's very hard to get high amounts of Frostbolts per second, unless you're using stuff like Cast on Crit or using stuff like other methods, basically, instead of self-casting. So because of this, turns out Ice Nova of Frostbolts is still better in the end, because 1, you don't need to min-max your ability to play the build, so you don't need to make sure you cast immediately your Frostbolt as soon as it gets to 1 Unleash stack, so that you can maximize your DPS. And you could just hold the button, right? If you press Arcanist Brand, you hold your Ice Nova on the boss will die, right? So in this case, over here on the left side, we have the Vortex of Projection DPS, the POE one that's not been edited, and then I have simulated the 45% DPS nerf, 4.1 million damage, but Ice Nova of Frostbolts, you can see here on my exact same setup with no changes, is 3.8 million DPS. So Ice Nova of Frostbolts is more consistent. Vortex of Projection is 4.1 million DPS if you play it exactly perfectly, which is just not practical in POE when you're dodging boss mechanics and you're doing other stuff like that. So the end of this, the final conclusion is I will be swapping over to Ice Nova of Frostbolts, and if they do end up changing it again, hopefully this video can give you an understanding of whether it's still good or bad. But the general gist that I have learned from this is that 1, Vortex of Projection is not that good, and it's gated by Frostbolts per second, which is hard to scale unless you use alternative means versus Arcanist Brand or self-casting. And Ice Nova of Frostbolts ends up still being good because the Frostbolts will always be on the boss somewhere and you can have good DPS. But yeah, that's going to wrap it up for this video. Hopefully this correction makes sense. And thank you for the commenter for actually mentioning this. It was an oversight from my behalf. And when I saw it, I was like, he's right. I have to fix this, right? So that's why this is out here. But yeah, cool. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the videos. And I appreciate the support on the previous one.